this discussion gets very interesting is that ethical. You are basically picking and choosing what you want, whether that's blonde hair, blue eyes, maybe it's male, female, maybe there are certain aspects. There are some really important details that come out of that genetic testing that really determines how they move forward with the embryos.
If there is a part of society that believes that life happens at conception and you're taking that conception, you're putting it into a test tube, you're doing it in a lab, then somebody, by nature of their own argument, would say, okay, all of those fertilized embryos are in fact little lives. We need to find a way to have them all be born, have them all become human. If you are just letting them fade away into the ether and you never do anything with them, technically that's murder.
There's always that concern or that controversy about, well, what happens when these kids all grow up and then they start dating each other and they don't realize that they are actually genetically related. That's another reason a lot of people push back on IVF, especially when it comes to surrogacies, when it comes to same-sex couples, when it comes to embryo donations. People push back a lot because they are worried about what happens when these genetic makeups that are not supposed to come together do come together. Medicine,
law, friendship. This is Dr. Long and Lawyer Nick. You're listening to the Medico-Legal Brief.
one doctor, one lawyer, and a whole lot of gray area. Welcome back to the Medico-Legal Brief here with Dr. Long and Lawyer Nick. Thanks for joining us for another exciting episode where we talk about medicine and law and how they intersect and affect our daily lives as professionals. The topic that we're going to talk about today is going to be revolved around genetic selection, or as the layman would probably know it better as IVF, where a couple is going through genetic testing, embryo creation, and selection of those types of embryos that they're looking for so that they can then bring it into a life form.
This should be an exciting topic today. It's going to be super scientific, so I'm going to lean on you a lot, Dr. Long, for the scientific nuance and background. But I'm hoping that I can kind of bring the social and philosophical and legal dynamic to a good conversation. I've met several people throughout my life that have had children by way of IVF. My understanding of it is, first and foremost, it is extremely expensive and it can be very time consuming, and you have to have a lot of patience. And there is a lot of medical nuance that goes on with IVF, where in some instances you can spend a lot of money, take a lot of time, and have negative results, if that's the appropriate term. And so I'm very interested to hear from you the approach as well as some of the background as we lead into the gene selection during IVF.
This topic is quite controversial in some pockets of society these days. Some people are very against it, some people are very for it, and then the majority of people are moderate, right in the middle. But the journey of IVF usually starts with a couple that has struggled or has come to the understanding that they are just not able to have a natural pregnancy or a natural birth, and they just need a little help in creating their families. That's usually the core reason why anyone would go towards IVF, because like you said, it is a very expensive process. It's multiple steps for not only the female partner, but also the male partner. And then in situations where you're using a surrogate, whether the female is not able to carry, or maybe it's a same-sex couple that is wanting to build their family, then the same idea is there, that you are selecting specific types of genetic codes that you deem are important so that you can create these embryos that eventually will turn into humans.
Exactly. And when you talk to parents that have had children by way of IVF, there's just nothing but positivity, positive feedback. They're super happy. They feel very blessed to have had the opportunity to go through the process and ultimately have a child. But then also, from a societal standpoint, depending on where you fall in your views, you have this negative connotation of a quote unquote test tube baby. And in some instances, a doctor or a couple playing God and not doing things the natural way. I'm definitely interested for this conversation and interested to dive in to the nuances of it, because in one case it's a blessing, and in the other case, for some people, it's an abomination. That's not ultimately what it should be looked upon as.
There's a way that we can describe it in simple terms, is that every pregnancy is not always intentional, but every IVF pregnancy or birth is very much intentional because of the time commitment, the money, the stress, everything that is poured into the process of building a family from IVF is very strenuous. I personally touched on an IVF journey myself, not the full-on IVF journey that we all would think of, but mine was a truncated one where we did use a surrogate so that we could have our son. And it was basically an embryo that was donated to us. But the couple that we had originally received the donation from had to put in the effort and time to not only retrieve the eggs from the female, but also get the sperm from the male and then inseminate the two in vitro so that they can then turn into an embryo and therefore be placed into the surrogate so that they can then become pregnant and carry this to their 9 months before birth.
Now, Dr. Long, is IVF in medicine considered the last step or the last opportunity before you start looking at things such as adoption?
It's not necessarily the last step, but it is a part of the steps. Usually when families or couples are not able to have kids, they have their options. They either decide, do they want genetically related offspring? Do they not care? And then whether or not they want to adopt through the system where a child has already been born and they are wanting to take them out of the system. It really is a very deep and personal conversation that they have to decide for themselves. But there is not a process or a protocol that you have to first try adoption or first try IVF before you can go to the other route. It's whatever you're ready or that is available to you that you can pursue. Usually the thing that keeps people from going the IVF route is usually the cost. The cost of it can build up very quickly because every round of the process can go multiple times. Retrieval of the egg doesn't always happen on the first go around. Maybe you only get 1 or 2 eggs. Sometimes you may get 12 or 15. Every person is different. Every process is different. Every procedure is different. It's hard to determine ahead. You can do estimates, but sometimes those estimates are not even close to what the end result will be.
In a world in which someone has unlimited funds, could they walk in, talk to their OB and say, hey, I just want to bypass everything and just go straight to IVF. I just want to do IVF from the very get-go. Let's work that. My partner and I aren't even going to try the old natural way. We're just going to do IVF. Is that something that could be considered, or is that shunned upon as opposed to, hey, we're just going to go knock boots and try to have a kid?
Absolutely, that can happen. And it's usually the starting conversation with your local OB/GYN, but then they will usually send you over to a specialist who specializes in these in vitro procedures to make sure that the process is streamlined. But because of the costs, most people would rather do it naturally if they're able to. But if there are other reasons why they don't want to, because they health-wise are not able to carry a pregnancy and it would be safe for them or the baby, so they forego that option by going via IVF. It's a very nuanced conversation. Every couple is very different, and the reasons for them choosing IVF is very different.
Okay. So going back, we're basically retrieving the eggs or retrieving the sperm. We're combining them in layman's terms. We're inserting them and we're hoping that we have a baby. Am I on point right that from a non-medical position?
That is a very clean and simple way of describing the process. But again, there's lots of hiccups along the way and speed bumps. But yes, it's pretty much the broad ideas.
Okay, looking at the process as a whole before we get to gene editing in the process and trait manipulation, what are, I guess, the chances of going through IVF and actually having a healthy baby?
Most pregnancies from all these processes, whether it's natural or IVF, tend to come out with a good possibility of a very healthy pregnancy. I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that it's above 70, if not 80% of pregnancies are going to come out healthy, completely fine. Again, everything comes with a cost. And so when we get to the nitty gritty, you have an opportunity during this process to get your embryos. So embryos are, once the sperm and egg have been combined and are now fertilized, you can actually do trait testing or genetic testing so that you can figure out, is this going to be a boy, a girl? Are there some genetic disorders that may be presented in this embryo if you were to bring it to birth, like Downs or the different trisomies? Those come with additional costs. Not every couple is going to want to do it. Some want to have that surprise. Some want to know because they want to know what they're dealing with, but also maybe they understand themselves that they're not willing to bring a human life forth, that they may not be able to give everything that they can emotionally, financially, health-wise.
My wife and I had that testing done at the 12-week mark, where we elected to get the testing so we could see if there was going to be any abnormalities or anomalies, and also figure out the sex. The most important thing was to figure out what sex we were going to have. And even that was an extra cost. That was an extra fee that we actually had to pay for. With IVF, Is it essential to wait the 12 weeks, or are you finding out the gene makeup a lot sooner than that?
You're finding out before it even gets implanted in the woman to be carried. So you are knowing prior. And this is where this discussion gets very interesting. Is that ethical? You are basically picking and choosing what you want, whether that's blonde hair, blue eyes, maybe it's male, female, maybe there are certain aspects. Obviously, we have not gotten to the point where we can know what shade of color they have or maybe the height of the child. But there are some really important details that come out of that genetic testing that really determine how they move forward with the embryos, whether they donate some of the embryos because they don't feel like they want to bring those to life, or maybe they get rid of it altogether, or maybe they decide we'll just go ahead and bring whatever we can to life and then move on from there. We'll take it day by day.
Now, I don't want to get too personal, but with your firstborn, you actually knew exactly what his makeup was, correct?
We knew that he was going to be Asian. We had 2 boy embryos and 1 female embryo. So we knew what we wanted to do there. And that was pretty much the amount of genetic makeup that we knew. The other thing is that there are certain grades. So when they do this genetic testing, they give a grade to the embryo, basically saying this is an A plus versus an A or a B or a C type embryo. And it just gives you an idea of how successful it will attach and grow appropriately. But just like in grade school, a kid may get a C, but then end up becoming a very successful doctor afterwards. It's just a grade at that moment in time, but it does not predict. It just gives you a percentage of success, but it does not guarantee whether or not it's going to be a good or bad process.
That point right there leads into this controversial take. So this isn't a conversation about abortion per se, but if there is a part of society that believes that life happens at conception and you're taking that conception, you're putting it into a quote unquote test tube, you're doing it in a lab, then somebody by nature of their own argument would say, okay, all of those fertilized embryos are in fact little lives. So we need to find a way to have them all be born, have them all become human. If you are just letting them fade away into the ether and you never do anything with them, technically that's murder. That's kind of where the controversy starts. Just before we even get to gene selection trait modification, it's the fact that there is an egg and a sperm that have come together to create life. And now you have a dynamic in which some people might view it as couples looking through the window saying, oh, I want that one, I want that one, I want that one. That one sounds pretty. That one sounds like it would be good for us. Let's go with this and see what happens.
You got it. Yep. And that's exactly where the controversy comes in. It's very much parallel to the abortion stance because these embryos or these fetuses have not reached a time in life where they are able to live on their own outside of the womb. And so some people will see that as a reason to be able to pick and choose because they feel like they cannot provide, whether that is the emotional, the financial needs of this fetus to be born and to be raised fully. And so many couples out there do make that very, very tough. It's not an easy decision, but very, very tough decision to either have an abortion or just not move forward by implanting that embryo. Again, it's a very nuanced conversation. It's a decision that's not ever easy. They put so much time, effort, finances into creating the embryos. They're not going to want to just throw it away. It's going to be a back and forth constantly in deciding whether or not it's going to be right for their family.
That's actually a very good, I guess, phrase that I want to dive into. You said they're not just going to want to throw it away. What happens with these embryos that aren't used? In everyone's mind, it's just you're taking a petri dish and you're throwing it in the trash. What actually formally happens if somebody decides not to move forward with an embryo?
There's a couple of ways. One, you can donate the embryo to another family who is not able to afford embryo creations themselves and they don't feel a necessary need to be genetically related to their offspring. That's a good option. That's what we did here in our family. We received embryos that are not genetically related to us. The other option is maybe they want to donate it to science or medicine because there's a lot of things that we can do with these embryos, whether that's checking DNA, genetic code, making modifications and seeing what happens. So many different things that would be helpful in furthering our science endeavors in society. And then lastly, it would be to just ethically remove the embryo and destroy the embryo. But again, most states require that all parties are involved. So when we received our 3 embryos, we actually implanted 2 embryos and we had 1 last embryo that honestly did not look great under the microscope. The physician who was going to implant the embryo also felt that it was probably not going to be a very successful pregnancy. And so we had to reach back out to our donors, so the original embryo donors, and just talk to them and decide, is it something that you guys are comfortable rather than donating it, rather than trying to bring this into a full pregnancy, we are going to ethically destroy and remove it.
As we have these conversations, my legal brain is always turning. I would be interested to see from a legality standpoint what states' laws on the books are as they look at abortion and as they look at terminating IVF embryos, and seeing if there's a correlation and a consistency across their take. It would be very interesting to see a state that allows abortion up to a certain point and have them see restrictions on how to appropriately and ethically terminate an IVF, and vice versa, and see just the overall legal consistency. Because in my brain, I can make the argument that it's almost one and the same. You have a fertilized embryo, just one's within the body, one's outside of the body. How are you as a state government or the federal government treating it? Are you being consistent, or are you finding the nuance, or is a different legal argument for each approach? And I think that's very interesting. I think that's very intriguing to take that approach. We've talked before. You can convince me one way or the other if you just have a good, sound legal argument, and I'll go back and forth all day toying around with these ideas. And so I find this extremely, extremely unique because I've seen the joy that IVF has brought parents, but I can also see the nuanced legal argument of, well, if you're going to treat one thing this way, you have to treat the other thing that's very similar that way. I appreciate this discussion, and I love that my brain starts turning when it comes down to it. But I think it's time to transition into the core of today's discussion, gene modification and trait selection when you're looking at these embryos. Give me some background. How did this come to be? When did we decide that we could start interacting with the genes and making these modifications in these embryos?
That's always been the goal, is to figure out how do we modify mutation, because as a human species, we're constantly dealing with cancers, mutations that cause diseases. And so the root of how we came to where we are now is because we were trying to figure out genetically what causes those mutations, what causes those changes, and how do we prevent them from happening so that we can cure cancer, so that we can cure diseases. And that led into, well, if we can do it for these diseases, why can't we do it for eye color or hair color? I don't think we are sophisticated enough to get to that point, or at least the availability of those options are not widely available yet to the public. But I know that there are some very high research systems that are able to do those sort of things. But again, they have not put it out into the ether yet to make it something that is universally looked at and considered.
Now, as of right now, do you know what we can modify genetically to avoid?
I know that there are a lot of pharmaceuticals out there, especially in the cancer universe, where a lot of these new, interesting, and just very intriguing scientific advancements are occurring, because they are, again, looking to try to find those issues and prevent it, fix it, etc. The other thing that we've had in the recent years is things like autism, ADHD, anxiety. Are these things that can be modified prior to birth or during pregnancy that might be able to prevent and relieve some of those stresses and diseases that may occur once the pregnancy comes to a full term?
That's something that I've definitely considered in at least my research. You have some individuals that see something such as Down syndrome, and some families embrace it and say, yes, this is something that we feel like we can grow with. And other couples and families say, hey, this is not something that we're well equipped to handle, so we're going to go ahead and terminate the pregnancy. And you get to the point of, all right, well, if you can spot it before it's there, and then you can alter it to where the child will not have Down syndrome, do you do it? And then you can go down this rabbit hole of, is it going to cost extra money? What are the ethics behind it? Are only the rich going to be able to do this? Then it leads down this path of, where does it end? At first, you're trying to be preventative, but then you start getting into the, can I genetically modify to then build up almost a superhuman and give my child all the traits that I want, whether it be eye color, hair color, height, weight, muscle mass, so on and so forth.
You got it. It's a very controversial conversation, controversial topic. But I think it's so important that it is a nuanced conversation because each family has their own unique struggles and stresses. That it's really important that if they are going to be bringing a human into their lives, that they're able to fully give them everything. I know that with my family of just two kids, a 2 and a 4-year-old, soon to be 5-year-old, we barely make it on a day-to-day basis. I can only imagine what it would be like and how much more stress it would be if we had one of the kids have a chronic illness, let alone both kids having a chronic illness for a long period of time, if not for the rest of their lives. That would completely change not only the ability to work, the ability to take care of them, the ability to take care of ourselves during these times, and whether or not you have the support system. There's so many things that come into it. It would be better improved if the goal was to bring all these babies to life and not make any terminations and selective decisions like this, is to have better support systems within our communities, whether that is healthcare, whether that it's social things like daycare and free lunches and just making things more affordable. But it's just not possible at this point in time, especially not in our society in the state that we are in.
It's just a very interesting take because I feel like we are very young in this process from a technological standpoint. And as we keep going and technology keeps advancing and the things that we try to achieve keeps advancing, I just wonder what that will end up being for the world. One interesting thing I came across was the fact that if we start editing genes and we go through the process of being selective with a certain trait, or we're trying to rid a certain genetic mutation, there's this weird sense that down the line it ends up impacting the world. I never really considered, because genes get passed down. If you modify your child's genes and then they find another individual who had modified genes, and then all of a sudden they have a baby, they're now passing down the genetics that were initially modified. So as you go through the world, you could essentially, in theory, rid the world of some negatives, but you could also introduce things that we may not have expected, especially in a situation in which science and medicine is constantly evolving, where we do something and 10, 15, 20, 30 years later, we find out that there was some other repercussion or some other side effect that nobody ever considered. It was an interesting take to hear that what we do now could impact your immediate society and then your country and then the world stage, when we only think about, oh, well, this is just my child. I'm just worried about my little familial sphere.
This topic is so big and broad. Making one change in this area of the genome may cause a downward effect later on in life. Maybe in a couple generations, you've selected for a kid to have a height of 6 feet and higher, but what if that causes a 7th toe or something? And there's just no way to know because the genome is so broad and so big, and we can only study a small portion of it at a time, and that we don't have enough time in a human life to be able to monitor the changes that we make now and what it will do and what it will change, or the effects that it will cause on society and the communities after. The other thing is, as we go through IVF, and especially as you are seeing more sperm donation, egg donations, there's always that concern or that controversy about, well, what happens when these kids are born, raised, or growing up, and then they start dating each other and they don't realize that they are actually genetically related? That's another reason a lot of people push back on this IVF, especially when it comes to surrogacies, when it comes to same-sex couples, when it comes to embryo donations. People push back a lot because they are worried about what happens when these genetic makeups that are not supposed to come together do come together.
It's really funny that you mentioned that, because I just saw a video on Instagram in which a man is calling his ex-girlfriend from 20 years ago. And 20 years prior, he was the side dude and she got pregnant. And so she broke it off because he was a side dude. Now, 20 years later, his daughter is dating her son. And so he had to call her up and have a conversation and say, wait, we never figured out if I was the father or not. So we need to do this because these two are in love. They've been seeing each other behind our backs for a year. And I need to know if my daughter is with her brother. And that's just a nuance of, hey, somebody was cheating on somebody and they just lived in the same community for 20 years. Here we get to the point of, okay, we're actually putting embryos all across the nation. And to your point, it's as easy as donating an embryo to another couple and then them taking that embryo and being in Seattle or being in New York City or being in Houston, Texas. There's constant movement in this day and age. And so I can definitely see the argument for that.
I don't know if you've seen the movie, but this conversation reminds me of the movie Gattaca with Uma Thurman, also Ethan Hawke. And it is exactly about this conversation where they are selecting the best of the best to be able to work these high-end jobs, whereas the low-tier genetic people are not getting to work in high-income professions. And so it dives into this sort of conversation and how controversial it is. It's interesting that was created. It was like 20 years ago, but it's a really good watch and you definitely should look it up.
This leads into a future discussion for a part 2 because there's a lot of legalities surrounding this. There's legalities on who owns the embryo. If parents get divorced, who owns the embryo? There's legalities on designer babies. It's quote unquote designer babies. Are you making a designer baby and just selecting what you want out of the traits? And then you can lead down the pathway of, okay, can insurance discriminate based on the embryo and what's going on with the embryo? Could there be discrimination based on race or sex at that point? And then you also have your typical medical malpractice. Can parents sue over things that happen with the embryo? What if there's wrong embryo transfer? What if there's misreported genetic results? So there's a lot of legality behind it that I want to investigate in the future with you. But one thing I want to leave us with, and I always like asking you these questions as a doctor, how would you consult a couple that comes in and says, hey, look, we've tried, we want to go through with IVF, we are worried about this, that, and the other? What would your general approach be to a couple that wants to investigate IVF more thoroughly?
My office, my medical office, is an open door. I'm here to help the patients fulfill their health needs and goals. My goal is to make sure that they are healthy, whether that's growing their family, whether that's making sure they lose some weight, whether that's reaching whatever health goal that they have. And so if the conversation leads to IVF, absolutely comfortable having that conversation, giving them a broad overview of what that entails, the process, some of the costs, but then I would then have to refer the patient over to the specialist who would be managing that. And they would do their due diligence as well as give their input and their expertise advice on what needs to happen and how do they prepare for this sort of thing. And it's a journey that doesn't happen very quickly. Even though a pregnancy is typically 9 months, this process can take up to years to come to fruition before you can even start the 9-month process of pregnancy. It's a big conversation, and sometimes it happens over a span of several appointments because the first time the couple usually brings it up as, oh, we've been struggling. Let's try some other natural things that maybe we haven't done before. Maybe let's try scheduling intercourse, making sure that it aligns with the female schedule. And then from there, if it's still not working, then we have to consider, okay, what's going to be covered by insurance versus what's not going to be covered, whether or not they have the cash reserves to be able to afford this. Are there any opportunities in the community that you're living at? Some of the more rural, some suburban areas don't have access to these specialists who deal with IVF, who work in the IVF field. And so it's really important to make sure that you have all the resources there, and that I try to make sure that I have the resources there for my patients when they do come in and ask.
Well, definitely appreciate that breakdown, Long. It's very, very important that people have all the information and do their research. And I feel like IVF is still on the newer horizon where people don't completely understand what's going on. But I appreciate the transparent conversation, and I'm looking forward to our future conversations that we have on the topic. But with that, it's been another episode of the Medico-Legal Brief where medicine meets the law. We appreciate you guys tuning in. Like, subscribe, follow. We're on all the socials, and we will see you next week, Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Central.
Yes, we're doctors. Yes, we're lawyers. No, this podcast is not medical or legal advice. Do not take anything we say as a reason to perform your own heart surgery, represent yourself in court, or diagnose your neighbor's rash. This is for entertainment only. Think of it like hanging out with your smartest, wittiest friends, not a substitute for an actual appointment. If you act on anything we say without talking to your own professional, that's on you. Seriously, don't do that.